I was supposed to fly from Italy only a few hours after that Russia started bombing Ukraine. And I must confess that I had mixed feelings about whether to leave or give up being here with you all at CPAC. In the end, I decided to be here because faced with this unacceptable attack.
What if the war in Ukraine could end tomorrow? What if a single decision from Europe could stop the bloodshed and bring peace? Viktor Orban and Giorgia Meloni are challenging the EU's narrative, exposing the hypocrisy and blind support for war. As tensions rise, a new Europe is emerging, one that refuses to follow the endless cycle of violence.
Magyarok határon innen és túl. Ma itt vannak velünk a lengyelek. Itt vannak velünk ma is, ahogy végig velünk voltak 1848-ban és 49-ben, és aztán a 20. században is. Miniszterelnök úr, kérem, fogadja a magyar emberek szívből jövő jó kívánságait.
Orban stands firm, questioning the EU's strategy, while Zelensky clings to hope. The stakes couldn't be higher. This is the moment that could change everything. It all began when Zelensky publicly criticized Orban, accusing him of being both anti-Ukrainian and anti-European. In an interview with an online platform, Zelensky went so far as to claim that Orban's stance on the war was driven by personal political gain, rather than the broader interests of the European Union or Ukraine. He argued that Hungary's lack of support for Ukraine, both militarily and financially, was part of a broader effort to please Russian President Vladimir Putin and ensure Orban's re-election. According to Zelensky, this was a critical error, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe as a whole. In response, Orban was quick to fire back. He took to social media, writing a post that directly addressed Zelensky's accusations. "We don't want our children to return from the front lines, and we don't want Hungarian money to go into Ukraine," Orban declared. He made it clear that Hungary's position was one of peace, not war. The Hungarian Prime Minister argued that the people of Hungary did not want to be dragged into the conflict, and that it was not their responsibility to fight a war that had no direct bearing on their national security. Zelensky's criticisms did not stop there. He further accused Orban of attempting to exploit Ukraine's suffering for personal political gain, suggesting that the Hungarian leader wanted to use the war to strengthen his own political position within Hungary and among his supporters. This accusation stoked the flames of tension between the two leaders, creating a deeper rift between Hungary and Ukraine, as well as between Hungary and the European Union. Orban, however, remained steadfast in his position. He found support from his foreign minister, Péter Szijjártó, who also strongly criticized Zelensky's attacks. Szijjártó accused Ukraine of running an anti-Hungarian propaganda campaign, particularly because Hungary had refused to send military aid to Ukraine or contribute significant financial support to the war effort. He pointed out that Zelensky's push for Hungary to provide more aid was an attempt to manipulate the Hungarian government and use it to further Ukraine's own political and military objectives. Szijjártó even went so far as to claim that Zelensky was trying to install a puppet government in Hungary that would funnel Hungarian resources into Ukraine. This was a serious accusation that further deepened the divide between the two nations. The conflict between Hungary and Ukraine is not just a matter of rhetoric. It has broader implications for the European Union. Hungary's refusal to fully support Ukraine's war efforts has drawn the ire of other EU member states, who see Hungary's stance as detrimental to European unity. Orban's approach has put him at odds with leaders in Brussels, where there is a growing push to increase support for Ukraine. However, Hungary's position has remained unchanged. Orban has consistently argued that Hungary will not be dragged into the war, and that the European Union should focus on peace rather than escalation. As the war in Ukraine continues, the pressure on Orban to change his position has increased, but he has remained firm. He has made it clear that Hungary is not interested in joining the conflict, and that the EU should focus on finding a diplomatic solution rather than providing more weapons and military support to Ukraine. Orban's position is rooted in the belief that the EU's strategy has been flawed from the start. and that it is time for a change in course. He has criticized the European Commission's handling of the crisis, particularly the way in which it has supported Ukraine, without taking into account the potential consequences for European stability. The tensions between Orban and Zelensky have reached a boiling point, with both sides now openly clashing in public. At a recent summit of the European political community in Budapest, Orban and Zelensky addressed the media separately, each outlining their positions on the war. Orban, in his usual blunt style, reiterated his calls for an immediate ceasefire and peace negotiations. He argued that the EU's current approach, which focuses on military support and sanctions against Russia, was not working, and that a new strategy was needed. Orban stressed that communication was key to finding a resolution, and that a ceasefire was the first step toward meaningful negotiations. Zelensky, on the other hand, has remained firmly against any proposal for a ceasefire that would involve Russia retaining territory gained during the war. He has called Orban's suggestion for a swift ceasefire dangerous and irresponsible, arguing that it would allow Russia to consolidate its gains and perpetuate the suffering of the Ukrainian people. Zelensky's frustration with Orban's position is palpable, and he has publicly questioned whether Orban truly understands the stakes of the war. He has asked, "Who are you? Are your children dying? Are your homes being destroyed?" For Zelensky, Orban's stance represents a refusal to acknowledge the harsh realities of the conflict and the immense human toll it is taking on Ukraine. Despite Zelensky's vocal opposition, Orban remains unfazed. He has even taken the extraordinary step of holding a phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin to discuss the state of the war and potential paths to peace. This call, which took place after Orban's visit to Donald Trump's residence in Mar-a-Lago, raised eyebrows in Europe and further strained relations between Hungary and Ukraine. Orban has also suggested that Hungary could broker a ceasefire agreement between Ukraine and Russia, pointing to past instances where Hungary has played a role in facilitating dialogue between opposing parties. In the face of mounting pressure, Orban's stance on the war shows no signs of changing. He continues to argue that the EU strategy has failed and that it is time for a course correction. For Orban, the war is not just a matter of foreign policy, it is a matter of national interest. He believes that Hungary must prioritize its own security and stability, and that the EU should not be blindly following the United States' lead in its approach to the war. Whether or not this position will have long-term consequences for Hungary's relationship with the EU remains to be seen. But for now, Orban seems committed to sticking to his guns. The political conflict between Viktor Orban and Volodymyr Zelensky has not only divided Hungary and Ukraine, but has also put Hungary at odds with much of the European Union. Orban's refusal to fully support Ukraine in its fight against Russia has become a point of contention that has drawn widespread criticism, particularly from EU leaders who see his position as damaging to European unity. Despite the mounting pressure, Orban remains steadfast, unapologetically sticking to his position on the war and urging for a significant shift in the EU's approach. One of Orban's most significant criticisms of Zelensky has been the Ukrainian president's call for more weapons and financial support from Europe. Orban has argued that the EU's strategy of providing Ukraine with military aid is not only ineffective, but also risks escalating the conflict further. He has pointed to the failure of EU policies thus far and called for a radical change in direction. Instead of continuing to send weapons and supplies to Ukraine, Orban insists that the EU should push for a ceasefire and begin peace talks as soon as possible. He argues that the EU's current approach is unsustainable and has only prolonged the suffering in Ukraine, with no clear end in sight. Orban's stance on the issue has drawn comparisons to US President Donald Trump's own position on the war. Both leaders advocate for an immediate cessation of hostilities and question the long-term viability of the EU's support for Ukraine. Orban has echoed Trump's rhetoric, suggesting that the war should be brought to an end as quickly as possible, and that the European Union should reconsider its role in the conflict. For Orban, this is not just a matter of policy, but a matter of European security and stability. He believes that the war in Ukraine has destabilized Europe and that the EU's involvement has exacerbated the situation, pushing Europe closer to the brink of a broader conflict. In an interview on the YouTube channel Patriota, Orban took the opportunity to further criticize Zelensky, calling him a comedian and questioning his ability to lead Ukraine through such a complex and difficult situation. Orban's comments were aimed at Zelensky's past as an actor, suggesting that his skills as an entertainer did not qualify him to handle the challenges of war. According to Orban, Zelensky's lack of experience in managing crises and his reliance on the international community for support have led to the prolongation of the war, with no resolution in sight. This sharp criticism of Zelensky has only served to intensify the conflict between the two leaders. While Zelensky has remained resolute in his calls for more support, Orban's message is clear: Hungary will not be drawn into the war, and the EU should rethink its support for Ukraine. For Orban, peace is the only way forward, and he has been vocal in his belief that a ceasefire and negotiations are the only realistic options for resolving the conflict. In recent months, Orban's position has gained more traction, particularly as the war in Ukraine shows no signs of ending soon. Many Europeans are growing weary of the ongoing conflict, and there is increasing concern about the long-term economic and political consequences of continued military support for Ukraine. Orban's calls for peace have found an audience among a growing number of European citizens who are tired of the war and its devastating effects on both Ukraine and the rest of Europe. His message resonates with those who believe that the EU has overstretched itself by getting involved in a war that is not of its making, and that a different approach is needed to secure peace. At a recent European Political Community Summit in Budapest, Orban and Zelensky continued their public dispute. Orban once again reiterated his calls for a ceasefire and peace negotiations, emphasizing that the EU's current approach had only contributed to the destruction in Ukraine. In contrast, Zelensky maintained his hardline position, rejecting any proposal for a ceasefire that would allow Russia to retain control over the territory it has captured during the conflict. For Zelensky, the war is a fight for the survival of Ukraine, and he believes that any compromise would be seen as a betrayal of the Ukrainian people. Zelensky's frustration with Orban's position is evident. He has publicly questioned whether Orban truly understands the gravity of the situation, asking rhetorically, "Who are you? Are your children dying? Are your homes being destroyed?" For Zelensky, the war is not just a geopolitical issue. It is a matter of life and death for the people of Ukraine. His comments reflect his belief that Orban, by advocating for peace at this stage of the conflict, is ignoring the harsh reality that Ukraine is facing. Zelensky's anger is rooted in his belief that Orban's position is both irresponsible and dangerous, as it could embolden Russia and prolong the suffering of the Ukrainian people. However, Orban has remained undeterred by Zelensky's criticisms. He continues to argue that the EU's strategy has failed and that a new approach is needed. Orban has even gone as far as to hold a phone conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin, which raised eyebrows across Europe. The conversation, which took place after Orban's visit to Donald Trump's residence in Mar-a-Lago, was seen by many as an attempt to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia. While Orban has not publicly disclosed the details of the conversation, his willingness to engage with Putin has further strained his relationship with Zelensky and other EU leaders. For Orban, the priority is clear: securing peace in Europe. He believes that Hungary must protect its own interests, and that the EU should not blindly follow the US or other major powers in its approach to the war. He has suggested that Hungary could play a key role in facilitating negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, but only if the EU is willing to change course and support a diplomatic solution. Orban's insistence on a peaceful resolution reflects his belief that war is not the answer, and that the EU must focus on finding common ground, rather than escalating the conflict. Meanwhile, Zelensky remains firm in his position, insisting that peace talks cannot happen without Ukraine's involvement. He has expressed concern that Orban's calls for a ceasefire are nothing more than an attempt to end the war on Russia's terms, which would be unacceptable to Ukraine. Zelensky's frustration with Orban is rooted in his belief that Hungary is not fully committed to supporting Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression. He has accused Orban of turning a blind eye to the suffering of the Ukrainian people and prioritizing his own political interests over the needs of Ukraine. As the war continues, the divide between Orban and Zelensky shows no signs of closing. Orban remains resolute in his belief that peace can only be achieved through negotiation, while Zelensky continues to demand more military and financial support from Europe. The outcome of this conflict will have far-reaching implications for Europe, and the tensions between Hungary and Ukraine are likely to shape the continent's future for years to come. Despite the ongoing disagreements, Orban and Zelensky's clash is not just a battle between two leaders. It is emblematic of a broader division within Europe. As the EU faces increasing pressure to support Ukraine, Hungary's defiance has highlighted the fractures within the Union. While some European leaders call for more intervention, others, like Orban, argue that the EU must reassess its role in the conflict and prioritize peace over military escalation. The ultimate question remains: will Europe find a way to bridge the gap between those advocating for war and those calling for peace, or will the divisions within the EU continue to deepen? Orban and Zelensky's clash is a reflection of the broader geopolitical forces at play in Europe. The EU is at a crossroads, and the decisions made in the coming months will determine the future of the continent. Orban, backed by his supporters, believes that peace must be the priority. For Zelensky, the fight continues until Ukraine's sovereignty is restored, and no compromises are acceptable. The struggle for Europe's future is far from over, and the resolution of this conflict will shape the continent for generations.